A few things should be mentioned before we move on from the death of Sejanus, and that is the uncertainty of our sources. We rely on Cassius Dio for the nature of the charges against Sejanus, and a distinction must be made between what we think we know he was guilty of and what he was actually executed for. Tacitus tells us he was plotting rebellion and that he conspired to poison the emperor's son, having succeeded in this after seducing the wife, Livilla. But these actions were not the technical charge before the Senate. Let's look at this paragraph from Cassius Dio to see the shakiness of our task of interpreting this. This is regarding the letter that Tiberius wrote to the Senate from Cassius Dio. In the meantime, the letter was read. It was a long one and contained no wholesale denunciation of Sejanus, but first some other matter, then a slight censure of his conduct, then something else, and after that some further objection to him, and at the close it said that 2 senators who were among his intimate associates must be punished and that he himself must be kept under guard. Is this what you want to be the gist of the charges against you at your capital murder trial? No wholesale denunciation? This is in the hour of his death. No wholesale denunciation. These words suggest that any plotted coup was omitted and any poisoning allegation was omitted. Those, I think, would have been wholesale denunciations. And the remaining clauses suggest trivialities. Some other matter? At first, some other matter? Something worth only a slight censure? And then something else. Something else might be my favorite clause in this. First some matter, then something slight, then something else, followed by something further, and better arrest him. Doesn't even say try him, it says arrest him. Tiberius threw him to the wolves, and he also gives his tacit sanction to further arrests by ordering those 2 senators to be punished. And as to the poisoning of his son, we do not know when Tiberius learned about this, but Cassius Dio says that Sejanus, his wife, after seeing their bodies on the stairway, composed a statement about the death of Drusus directed against Livilla, his wife, and then she committed suicide. Tiberius came to read her statement. He put to death Livilla. So what follows is that same behavior continues in Rome, which is to say the behavior of accusations being made over some nonsense that someone said, and the accusers get paid. That behavior. Only now the accusations have shifted to people who are associated with Sejanus. Tacitus writes, "Frenzied with bloodshed, the emperor now ordered the execution of all those arrested for complicity with Sejanus. It was a massacre without discrimination of sex or age, eminence or obscurity. There they lay, strewn about or in heaps. Relatives and friends were forbidden to stand by or lament them, or even to gaze for long." Tacitus also tells us accusers were now intensely active. Their present targets were men who enriched themselves by usury. As these prosecutions rose, Tiberius addressed the issue with a bailout. He, as in Tiberius, distributed 100 million sesterces among specially established banks for interest-free 3-year state loans. Now I have to resist the urge to tangent here. I love contemplating the risks of indebtedness, so I have to move on to the theme of this final video on Tiberius, the emperor's monstrous proclivities, which may well have been endemic in this most debauched age. Tacitus writes, "At Rome the massacre was continuous. People sentenced to death forfeited their property, and this is why they so frequently killed themselves before trial. That Tiberius relished in the bloodshed we are free to infer from these lines, which conclude a paragraph pertaining to one of the many victims. When Tiberius heard of these events, he was not, as hitherto, across the sea, receiving messages from afar, but near the city, where he could answer the consul's letters on the same day or after a single night, and could almost gaze at the homes deluged in blood and the executioners at work. he would come near to the coast in his ship, as though he would return to the mainland and Rome, and then he'd turn round and go back to his lair on Capri, as though he wanted to come as near as he dared to the scent of the destruction he had caused. So let's remember that he had been living on Capri since the mid-20s AD, and very soon after his first day there, Suetonius gives us this charming tale. A few days after he reached Capri and was by himself, a fisherman appeared unexpectedly and offered him a huge mullet, whereupon, in his alarm that the man had clambered up to him from the back of the island over rough and pathless rocks, he had the poor fellow's face scrubbed with the fish. And because in the midst of this torture the man thanked his stars that he had not given the emperor an enormous crab that he had caught, Tiberius had his face torn with the crab also. In his Caprian court he had dwarfs attending him, we know from Suetonius. This historian reports he would trick men into loading themselves with copious draughts of wine, and then on a sudden tying up their private parts, would torment them at the same time by the torture of the cords and of the stoppage of their water. You know, some people pair wine with food. This guy pairs it with a very specific torture, the torture of the cords. Suetonius tells us that while he was alive, at Capri they still point out the scene of his executions, from which he used to order that those who had been condemned after long and exquisite tortures be cast headlong into the sea before his eyes, while a band of marines waited below for the bodies and broke their bones with boat hooks and oars. Tacitus tells us, free-born children were his victims. He was fascinated by beauty, youthful innocence, and aristocratic birth. New names for types of perversion were invented. Slaves were charged to locate and procure his requirements. If resisted by parents or relations, kidnapped their victims and violated them on their account. The ruination of families, the degeneration of household, the separation of children is apparently the prerogative of perverts. To understand the inner workings of Tiberius, with his monstrous libertine habits, there really is only one writer that I'm aware of who can be of use in contemplating him, and that is the Marquis de Sade. As we read here in Juliet, the words of this character, Saint Fond, who is a minister in the French government, who abuses his position to do really the same thing Tiberius does, round up his victims. He directs the main character, Juliet. Here, these are his instructions. These victims must meet certain specifications. Firstly, Juliet, the ugliest of them all has got to be at least as well favored as yourself. I accept none younger than 9, nor above 16 years of age. Each must be a virgin, of excellent birth, titled, if possible, wealthy in any case. He goes on to explain, murder is the sweetest of all my voluptuous practices. There are no limits to my fondness for blood. Shedding it is the foremost of my passions. Unapologetic of his corruption, St. Fond says this regarding the people themselves. If I thought gold flowed in their veins, I'd have every one of the people bled to death. Interestingly, the Marquis de Sade breaks character with a footnote here, as though he's trying to help us. Let's read this footnote. There, by such tokens, may you recognize them, those monsters that abounded under the ancient regime and personified it. Tiberius also expressed this apocalyptic indifference to human tragedy, as we see in Cassius Dio, Book 58. At all events, he is said to have uttered frequently that old sentiment, when I am dead, let fire o'erwhelm the earth. And Cassius Dio continues with, often also, he used to declare Priam fortunate because he involved both his country and his throne in his own utter ruin. But something else struck me as a similarity between the 18th century age of the Libertine and this 1st century age of Tiberius. And that is how widespread was this behavior, and to what extent did it degrade what was sacred? If we read Justine by the Marquis de Sade, there is a scene in which Justine, the main character, who fits the description of both Tiberius and St. Fond's victims. She's an adolescent of aristocratic birth, but she was impoverished because her parents were swindled. She is wayward and wandering through France from one misfortune to another, and she comes across a place called St. Mary in the Wood, a Benedictine monastery well off the beaten path with no habitation nearby. But once she is inside, she finds that everyone there is like Tiberius, and she is imprisoned, and unspeakable things are done to her. And when I see this, the idea of a monastery in the 18th century being an enclave for tortures, I wonder whether or not there was a similar degradation of pagan holy places during the 1st century. I have nothing to prove this correlation, but I wonder when I read these lines from Tacitus. In Greek cities, criminals were increasingly escaping punishment owing to over-lavish rites of sanctuary. Delinquent slaves filled temples. Asylum was granted indiscriminately to debtors escaping their creditors, even to men suspected of capital offenses. Protecting religious observance, these communities were protecting crime itself. I think we're allowed to wonder what's going on in these shrines. You've got people coming into them who have no other option but to stay. They're stuck, or they're facing prosecution. They're certainly at the mercy of whoever is there. And when we see that these holy places had to send delegations to Tiberius in order to request that their rites of sanctuary be continued, they had to couch their claims in these old-fashioned pagan stories, these stories that everyone likes, that invoke Apollo and Diana, Aphrodite. All of these people are invoked in protecting this. Was this an age in which paganism hit its rock bottom in sanctity? Suetonius tells us that under Tiberius, Gaius Caligula was appointed augur before he was invested with the office. He was advanced to that of pontiff with strong commendation. So these monsters aren't just serving the governmental authority, they are occupying religious posts as well. Tying this concept to what we have previously seen, where we see retribution upon retribution, we see Tacitus lamenting, everyone competed for priority in marking down the victim. Sometimes this was self-defense, but mostly it was a sort of contagion, like an epidemic. Listen to the vocabulary of Tacitus here, discussing the end of a guy named Cotta. Beggared by extravagance, disgraced by evil-doing, he received the compliment of a vengeance. Complimentary vengeance. Just after the fall of Sejanus, Cassius Dio comments, thereupon one might have witnessed such a surpassing proof of human frailty as to prevent one's ever again being puffed up with conceit. For the man whom at dawn they had escorted to the Senate Hall as a superior being, they were now dragging to prison as if no better than the worst. Consider the laments of this process in the play Electra by Euripides. In that play, Electra and Orestes plot the death of their own mother Clytemnestra as vengeance for her murder of their father. But when Clytemnestra defends herself against this murder, this is what she points out. Tiberius gave me to your father, not so that I or my children should die, but he lured my daughter to Aulis, where the fleet was held, and there stretched her over the sacrificial altar and slashed the white throat of Iphigenia. She's referring to the fact that her husband, Agamemnon, sacrificed their daughter. But she continues, though I was wronged in this, I did not turn wild, and I would not have killed my husband, but he came back to me with his girlfriend, a mad prophetess, and brought her into our marriage bed, and he kept 2 wives together in the same house. This is her explanation. She killed someone out of vengeance. This doesn't save her. Her own children, Electra and Orestes, kill her. They come out of the house covered in her blood. And what does Orestes say? Racked with guilt. O Phoebus, the justice you proclaimed was mysterious, but clear are the woes you have brought to fulfillment. Electra agrees. She exclaims, "Oh, woe is me!" And the chorus, comparing these two with words that could be applied to these Romans after the fall of Sejanus. Your thoughts have changed back, shifting with the winds. Acts of retribution against what was also considered to be an act of retribution, and the constant revolving cycle popping out new victims seeking their own vengeance in kind. What ethos must this world be hungry for? coming from Judea, they will hear a creed that says to do unto others as they do unto you. And while the modern secularist can scoff that this is a plainly obvious truth, it must have felt like a refreshing novelty at the time. The idea of offering up your other cheek to the person who has struck the first. The idea of forgiving the trespass. That is the only way to break this cycle of retribution. One victim must say, I will not avenge the trespass against me.